very much. All right. Do I have to turn this on or just talk? Okay. So thank you very much to Dr. Trim and the organizers for the invitation to speak here today. Yes, first a quick introduction to TEDx, the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. We are a nonprofit research institute that advocates for and practices the objective and transparent translation of basic research on endocrine disrupting chemicals. And hopefully you didn't confuse us with the community organized TED Talks that actually go by the same initials. So today I'm going to tell you, I think, something everyone in this room already knows, and that's that our current use of plastics is bad for our health. Of course, we've heard several different ways that this can be judged, but I'm going to focus on how components of plastics disrupt our endocrine system. So I'll start with the discussion of what endocrine disruptors are, how we're exposed, and why they concern us. Endocrine disruptors are chemicals that interfere with any aspect of hormone action. This means that they can block, mimic, or otherwise disrupt our body's normal hormonal signals. Hormones exert their effects at very small doses as chemical messengers sending signals from one cell or tissue to another. Working together, they orchestrate vital functions such as the ones that I've listed here. And so disruptions, even very small ones to this finely tuned system, have the potential to result in substantial and sometimes permanent impacts on our health. In fact, a recent analysis estimated that the US health burden related to endocrine disrupting chemicals is $340 billion a year. And this is due to the impact of diseases and disorders such as obesity and diabetes, loss of IQ and ADHD, cardiovascular mortality, and reproductive effects. And about 56 billion of this was attributed to plastics and cans. So how are we exposed? Exposure can occur from eating or drinking food that contains the chemicals, sometimes as a result of contact with the food packaging, like we heard about in the bisphenol A lining of metal food cans. It can also occur when we breathe indoor or outdoor dust that might contain things like phthalates or flame retardants that escape our furniture and our carpets. It can also occur when we use personal care products and cosmetics, or when we handle thermal receipt paper that's coated in free BPA. So an important point that I'd like to make here is that many of the endocrine disrupting chemicals that we're concerned about in plastic are also found in other everyday consumer products. This means that we're actually really living in a chemical soup where we're constantly exposed to small doses of the chemicals that have been deemed safe by regulatory agencies, even though they haven't necessarily been evaluated for their ability to disrupt the endocrine system. And so that leads to why we at TEDx think that the endocrine disrupting properties of chemicals deserve special attention. And this is because historically there haven't been methods in place to adequately test or regulate these types of chemicals. And so I'm going to highlight 3 unique aspects of endocrine disruptors that make them a challenge to study, whether they come from plastics or elsewhere. The first is that effects that are observed at the low doses of exposure are very different than the types of effects that you see at high toxic doses of exposure. And so because the endocrine system controls such a wide variety of biological processes, it's important that we adequately study the most sensitive endpoints, the endocrine-mediated endpoints, for example, neurodevelopment or mammary gland development. And unfortunately, traditional toxicology studies that are used by regulatory agencies haven't always looked at these types of endpoints. The next issue is exposure. So for many endocrine disrupting chemicals, the dose that we're exposed to falls right here, where we expect endocrine-mediated outcomes. And again, traditional toxicology studies haven't always evaluated the low doses. An additional aspect here is this issue of chronic exposure to low doses of chemicals, and we're just really not sure how our multiple chemical exposures throughout our lifetime might interact to impact our long-term health. And last but not least is timing. And this again is 2 separate issues. First is the age of exposure. So fetuses and developing children are the most at risk to the harmful effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals because this is the time when the body's systems are being established and developed. The next issue is the sometimes long latency between the time of the exposure and when the outcome can be detected, which can make causality really difficult to establish, especially in epidemiological studies. So with that introduction to plastics, or introduction to endocrine disrupting chemicals, let's now look at the components of plastics that cause endocrine disruption. According to the American Chemistry Council, there's over 1,000 different types of plastics. And as you already know, it's not only the plastic polymer itself, for example, the bisphenol, in this case, that can cause endocrine disruption, but also the chemical additives that are added to the plastics to give them their different and unique characteristics. So I've listed here just a few examples of well-known endocrine disrupting chemicals that are commonly found in different types of plastics, and then the different functions that they serve. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on these first three groups and highlight some of the growing body of evidence for endocrine disruption from these types of chemicals. I'll start with bisphenol A, which is the chemical that is polymerized to form polycarbonate plastics. It's used in a variety of consumer products, everything from the resin lining of metal food cans to PVC and thermal receipt paper. And due to its widespread use, it is widely detected in the population. And it was first described as an estrogen, but now we know that it can disrupt other hormone systems as well, including the androgen receptor and the thyroid receptor. And then in 2013, my colleague at TEDx, Joe Rochester, reviewed over 75 epidemiological studies that link BPA to human health effects. And these include everything from obesity and ADHD to asthma and reproductive effects. And so about 10 years ago, there was growing consumer pressure and mounting evidence against BPA, and the manufacturers started to phase out the use of BPA, and it started in baby bottles, but it's now grown. And so when you go to the store, almost every plastic bottle you pick up says BPA free on it. So of course the question is, if they're not using BPA, what are they using? Turns out that for us, that information isn't necessarily easy to obtain. We know that at least in some applications, they use a drop-in substitute, so a chemical that is similar enough that it's not going to actually affect their production process, or it's not going to impact the final product and the usability of that product. And so in this figure here, I've listed 24 different potential replacements for BPA, and these are not necessarily just for plastic. This list is also derived from potential replacements for BPA in thermal receipt paper. And then during my postdoc at the National Toxicology Program, I conducted a state of the science review on the available toxicology data for that group of 24 chemicals. And at the time of the literature search, there were no publicly available data for 8 of the chemicals, and relatively little data available for the remaining chemicals, especially when we think about how much has been published on BPA. And unlike BPA, where there's a growing body of evidence on the human health effects, there were only 4 studies on the health effects of these chemicals. And it was really limited to just dermal sensitization or contact allergy for 2 chemicals. So with a lack of human data, we next looked at the available in vitro and animal studies in order to determine if these chemicals are similar enough to BPA that we should be concerned about them. And so like BPA, most of the studies that have been published on the BPA analogs investigate their potential to disrupt estrogen signaling. And a very common study screening tool that is used is the uterotrophic assay, where juvenile rodent uterus is measured, and in response to estrogenic chemicals, its size is increased. And so what I'm showing here are the 6 available studies, or the studies that measured 6 different BPA analogs in the uterotrophic assay. And the conclusion is that although they range in the potency and efficacy of the response, all 6 of these chemicals are also estrogenic in this assay. And like BPA, the BPA analogs are active across multiple endocrine-mediated endpoints. So in this assay, I used data from the Tox21 high-throughput screening system, where nearly 10,000 different environmental chemicals have been tested in over 50 biological in vitro assays. And the important point here is that each different slice of the pie indicates a different type of assay. So the red slices are estrogen receptor agonism assays, and the blue are androgen receptor agonism assays, and so on. And then the height of the pie slice indicates how active the chemical is in that type of assay. So if a chemical doesn't have a slice of pie, then it's not active in that assay, in this test system. So what I hope you can appreciate is that for BPA and most of the BPA analogs, they are estrogen receptor agonists. It means that they act like estradiol, but that they're also active in other hormone assays. So you see this yellow slice is glucocorticoid receptor antagonism. You see the light blue slice, androgen receptor antagonism, are common among the BPA analogs as well. So generally speaking, when the available animal and in vitro evidence is considered together, it suggests that these BPA structural and functional analogs are similar enough to BPA that we should be of concern. Because if the observed human health effects from BPA are initiated or influenced at all by endocrine-mediated mechanisms, then these chemicals can act in that same way. And so we really need to consider this so that we avoid a situation of regrettable substitution. So next, I'll talk about phthalates, which are a group of more than 40 chemicals that make plastic softer and more flexible. They can also be used to make fragrances last longer. Again, they're widely detected in the population, but unlike BPA, their mode of action is a little bit more limited. They're mostly thought of as being anti-androgenic. But despite this more narrow mechanism of action, they are also linked to increasing numbers of human health impacts, especially male reproductive diseases and metabolic disorders. So to demonstrate the risk that phthalates pose to humans, I'll highlight this recent National Academies of Science report that used systematic review to assess the human health effects of 8 different phthalates on 3 different outcomes of male reproductive disorders. So anogenital distance, fetal testosterone concentration, and hypospadias incidence are all markers of disrupted testosterone signaling during fetal development. And what I hope you can appreciate is that for 7 of the 8 chemicals, there was enough evidence for the National Academies of Science to conclude that these chemicals were either presumed or suspected human health hazards. This report also noted that it will be important moving forward to include pharmacokinetic evaluations that provide comparable biomonitoring data for animals and people so that these 2 evidence streams can be more directly compared. And this is an important point to consider not just for phthalates, but for endocrine disruptors in general and environmental chemicals. And then finally, I'll highlight triclosan and triclocarban, which are 2 chemicals that are added to plastics and other consumer products for their antimicrobial properties. And like the bisphenols and phthalates, they're also widely detected. And a recent document, the Florence Statement on Triclosan and Triclocarban, was signed by over 200 scientists, including us at TEDx, and it highlighted the unintended adverse health and environmental impacts from continued use to these and similar antimicrobial chemicals. And specifically, there were concerns for increased allergy sensitivity, advanced puberty, and thyroid hormone disruption. And to expand on that last point, a recent systematic review out of UCSF by Johnson and colleagues concluded that triclosan is possibly toxic to reproductive and developmental health. And this finding was based largely on some of the meta-analyses that were included in this review. And an example one I've shown here, where the vertical gray bar would indicate no effect. The individual studies that were considered are shown in the red and green, and then the meta-analysis effect is this gray diamond. And what it indicates is that decreased thyroxine in rats is observed following juvenile exposure to triclosan. And this is an important finding since thyroxine is important during neurodevelopment. And if you don't have the right amount, it has long-term health impacts. And then I'll also note here that at TEDx, we have just also submitted a scoping review on the other chemical that I mentioned, triclocarban, where we call attention to the growing literature that indicates triclocarban can disrupt estrogen and androgen signaling and might also have impacts on growth and metabolic impacts. So today I have highlighted just some of the most well-known endocrine disruptors in plastics, but in reality, there are other chemicals that we haven't yet identified, though we can sometimes detect their biological activity in everything from baby pacifiers to our drinking water bottles that we buy at the store. And so really, we're just beginning to scratch the surface in understanding this problem. So to conclude, I'll leave you with these take-home messages. The adverse effects from endocrine disruptors occur at levels that are considered safe by the EPA and other regulatory agencies. And these are levels that are within the range of current human exposures. Infants and children are particularly susceptible to the harmful effects of endocrine disruptors, and therefore steps must be taken to specifically protect them. Endocrine disruption is linked to numerous diseases and disorders, which causes a significant financial and societal burden. And regrettable substitution must be avoided, especially for bisphenols and phthalates and the antimicrobials, where we already know that the chemicals that we're currently using are able to disrupt our endocrine systems. And with that, I would like to introduce you to the rest of the TEDx team and thank the organizations that fund our work and all of you for your attention.
Thank you so much. We have time for one question. Right here.
Where do we hide?
Where do we hide?
I wish I knew. I don't have.
Okay, one more question.
What type of plastic? Engineering plastic?
The antimicrobials, triclosan and triclocarban, they're used in a variety of plastics. That, like cutting boards have triclosan in them a lot. Anything where people are afraid that germs are going to stick to them. I'm not a manufacturer, so I don't.
Toilet flushers.
What's that? Toilet flushers, toilet bowl cleaners.
There were several like healthcare applications as well that people have seen as well.
They are in other products besides plastics, definitely personal care products.
All right, let's thank Dr. Pelch.